Our next guest is Leith Van Onselen, the unconventional economist, who is such a popular person on this program. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
A pleasure. Now, you've prepared for us three of your very recent commentaries, and you begin with Australia should be the richest country. Could you tell us why we should be the richest country?
Well, this article is based on a really good podcast that was done by Matt Barry, who's one of Australia's best thinkers. He's the CEO of freelancer.com, and he's one of the few people who's in a leadership position in the country who actually tells it like it is and actually can see Australia for what it is. And Matt Barry made the salient point, the points that Australia basically controls or has a huge share of everything that the world needs at the moment. So it is energy rich, outside of oil, it's energy rich in everything. It's got oodles of natural gas, coal. It's the world's biggest iron ore exporter. We have heaps of lithium, which has been used in the battery revolution, nickel, uranium. We've basically got everything that the world needs. And his whole point is, given that we have so much of what the world needs, we should be one of the world's richest countries, and an absolute superpower is what he said. But what Matt Barry noted is that we don't tax any of this stuff properly, which is what I've said over and over again. We also don't add value to it. So Australia just basically has one of the least complex economies in the world. So according to Harvard's Economic Complexity Index, we're ranked in the 90s somewhere, below a whole bunch of African nations, because we have just such a simple economy whereby we just dig stuff up and sell it and then import people as well to just fuel population growth and economic growth that way. And he said that this is basically doing us a disservice. It's meant that we've got a low productivity economy. We've also, as I've repeatedly said, we have engineered an energy crisis in the country. So despite owning or controlling just about everything the world needs outside of oil, we have managed to create an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis in this country. Most notably, as I've said over and over again, through the gas market. We are the second biggest gas exporter in the world. And yet we have engineered a cost crisis in gas and electricity, etc. Even though we are the second biggest gas exporter in the world, we're also the biggest coal exporter. And then yet we have some of the world's highest electricity prices and gas prices. And this has basically driven Australia's manufacturing sector to be the lowest in the developed world. Second lowest, I think, behind Liechtenstein, which is basically a financial haven.
Yeah. And if we can show the terms of trade of this century, it's extraordinary the way in which Australia shot ahead of just about every other similar country.
Yeah, and again, this is in the areas where Australia has massive control of. So basically all the commodities here, iron ore, coal, natural gas, nickel, lithium, uranium, you go on. It doesn't matter what it is. Australia is one of the top exporters and producers in the world, and yet we haven't got much to show for this. So
you've been arguing, haven't you, that we should have a sovereign fund, as Norway does, and I think we've got a chart showing that, the way the Norwegians tax their resources and the way they keep some of it back. They just don't waste it on the NDIS or the various activities the government does, green hydrogen and so on. The money is there for the people of Norway in a very safe bank, which is investing their money on behalf of them.
Yeah, that's right. So Norway basically taxes its oil and gas at around 80%. So and a lot of its producers are actually government owned, and as a result, it's accumulated a massive war chest of money, and it invests this in the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is actually the biggest wealth fund in the world, and it's basically that fund invests abroad. So it doesn't invest within Norway, it invests in companies all around the world. So it's one of the biggest shareholders of Microsoft. I think it is the biggest shareholder of Microsoft, for example. And that fund is now worth $270,000 US per Norwegian citizen. So we've got this country of about 5.5 million people. So it's a little bit bigger than Melbourne and Sydney. And it's sitting on this ginormous pile of wealth. So even if they stopped selling, exporting tomorrow, they'd still be rich because they've got this huge endowment fund. Whereas Australia, on the other hand, we export way more than what Norway exports. And we actually have very little to show for our mineral wealth because we don't do any of this stuff. We don't tax our resources properly. We don't have a sovereign wealth fund. And as a result, we basically don't have much to show for our wealth. And it's not just Norway, David, it's also Qatar. So I mentioned that Australia is the second biggest gas exporter. Well, just behind us, like we're almost tied, but in third place is Qatar. So in 2003, Australia exported 81 million, I think it's petajoules of gas, and Qatar exported 80 million. So it was basically, almost tied. And Qatar basically, like Norway, uses its funds from its gas properly. And as a result, Qatarians don't pay any tax. They have free healthcare, free education, and they pay not much. They pay very low prices for both energy, electricity and petrol prices. So, and petrol. So Qataris are benefiting immensely from their natural gas boom, which is slightly smaller than ours, whereas Australians aren't benefiting at all. I'd argue that our huge LNG export boom is actually making us poorer on the East Coast because it's driven up our cost.
Could I suggest that you do a graph showing the percentage of the population which are career politicians in a number of different countries, and see whether we have more career populations per population than other countries?
I would if I could find the data. I think that might be quite hard to get, but I suggest that we'd have a very high share because we have 3 levels of government here. Most countries have 2. And also, we have just an enormous amount of people working in the bureaucracies in Australia. So
well, this is very good. Could we go then to the second thing you've just been talking about, which seems to be avoided by the politicians, and certainly the politicians, by much of the media? That is that we are in the middle of a record-breaking recession. At least, what is that all about?
So not a recession in the aggregate, traditional sense. So the way a recession is traditionally measured in Australia is they call it a technical recession. So you have a recession if the economy shrinks for 2 consecutive quarters. Now, it's very hard for Australia in the traditional sense to have a recession because we're running a mass immigration program, and our population, for example, grew by 2.4% last financial year. So when you've got 2.4% population growth, it's pretty hard to have a recession. However, once you strip out that population growth, we have had 6 consecutive quarters of GDP per capita decline. And that's how we really should be measuring a recession, because we should be measuring it on a per person basis, because that's what matters. And that is actually
the graph is showing, I think, on the screen. Could you tell us what the graph means?
Yeah, so the graph shows Australia's headline, so overall GDP growth against Australia's GDP per capita growth. And what it shows is that the overall economy continues to grow very slowly, but we're actually going backwards per person. We have gone backwards for 6 consecutive quarters and 7 of the last 8 quarters. And that is actually the longest decline in per capita GDP in modern records, in modern history. So records dating back to the early 1970s. Now, it's not the deepest. The early 90s recession was sharper, but this has been the longest, most protracted decline. And it's going to get worse, David, because the OECD released their economic forecast for Australia, so the latest economic outlook, and actually downgraded Australia's growth to overall aggregate growth to just 1.1% this calendar year from 1.5% previously. And given that the population is growing by about 2.4%, that means that we're going to go backwards, even more.
And you predict, or you find from the present information, and you've got charts to show this, which we're putting up, that the Australian economy, sadly, faces decades of stagflation.
Yeah, that's right. So unfortunately, because we've been running this big Australia policy, what's happened is we've had what's called capital shallowing. So what that is easiest way to explain it, it's basically when the population grows faster than you can grow business investment and infrastructure. And what it means is you end up with less capital per worker, which means that your productivity slides. So just to give a stylized example of that, if you had a cafe whereby you had two workers who share a coffee machine, say those two workers can produce 50 coffees now, right? If you double the number of workers, so you have 4 workers sharing one coffee machine, you're not going to be able to create as many coffees per worker, because those workers will be sharing, you have 4 people sharing one coffee machine rather than 2 people. And what it means is they'll end up bumping into each other, have to wait for each other, there'll be congestion waiting to use that coffee machine, etc. And that's effectively what's happened to the Australian economy. So we've grown the population by 8.4 million people this century, which is unbelievable growth through immigration. And yet we haven't built enough infrastructure for that population. We haven't had enough business investment for that population. And as a result, Australia's productivity growth has plunged, and so has Australia's per capita GDP growth. And what that chart shows is that when immigration was more than doubled in the mid-2000s, Australia's productivity and GDP growth then fell. And that relates to this capital shallowing problem. And the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank, so it's the overseer of the world's central banks, released some research on productivity across the world. And what it showed is that Australia and Canada have basically, one of the reasons why they've got poor productivity is because of this capital shallowing effect, because we had business investment and infrastructure has not kept up with this population growth that both Australia and Canada have. And what the BIS says is that as long as we've got this poor productivity growth, we're going to have sluggish per capita GDP, and we're also going to have higher inflation than it would otherwise be. So that basically means that Australia is likely to experience a period like we had in the early 70s, although the early 70s reasons were different, whereby we have low growth and higher inflation, which is called stagflation. And it's basically a recipe for a pretty poorly performing economy. And unfortunately, this all gets back to Australia's broken economic model, which is effectively to import massive amounts of people into the economy. It's to create lazy growth while productivity declines and per capita GDP growth declines. So it's not a particularly good economic model. And I'll just remind viewers that the 2023 Intergenerational Report projected that Australia's population would grow by more than 13 million people in the next 39 years. Now, that's just to put that into perspective, that's like adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to Australia's current population in just 39 years. Now, if you can picture that, if you live in Sydney, just picture another Sydney and then another Melbourne and another Brisbane worth of people being added in only 39 years. Now, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to realise that there's very little chance that Australia will build enough infrastructure for that population. We're not going to build enough, we're not going to have enough business investment to support that population, and we're not going to have enough housing to support that population. So what that means is that our productivity is going to continue to decline and be very poor. It means that we're going to have lower per person economic growth going forward, and ultimately means we're going to have lower living standards ahead. And that's, that relates back to this big Australia model, which is really just a model for dumb economic growth, headline growth, while individually we all go backwards.
Leith, just to conclude, can we just recall what I suggested to you was what your figures were showing, and you agreed, and that is that the governments are incentivising young Australian families against having children, and they're replacing those children to Australian couples with large numbers of imported people into Australia.
Yep, absolutely, and that's the future. I mean, if I live in Melbourne, Melbourne's population was 3.5 million people at the turn of the century, so in 2000. It's projected to grow to 9 million people by 2056. That's an increase of 5.5 million people in only 56 years. Now, that means that basically future Melburnians are going to have to live in high-rise apartments, and they're going to be small high-rise apartments, and that is not conducive to having a family. And if we keep going down this path, the birth rate's going to continue falling. People are going to have less and less children. They won't be able to afford it. Plus, they'll be stuck in, accommodation that's not suitable. And there won't be enough schools, etc. And the federal government's brainiac solution will be, instead of to not create the problem in the first place, it'll be to keep ramping up immigration to compensate, which will then just make the birth rate fall even more. So, it's basically a recipe for falling living standards that the government's running here.
So they are pushing us into becoming the Argentina of the South Seas.
That's right, and that is exactly what Matt Barry said in his presentation, David. I'll send you a link to it off air, but he actually quoted Argentina. He said that at the turn of last century, Argentina and Australia were the two richest nations, and through socialism and etc., Argentina has basically become a backwater, and Australia, unfortunately, is on its way as well.
Yes, people don't realise this. It is easy to move from the first world to the third world because we have an excellent example of a magnificent country which went that way because of the Argentinian politicians, who were very popular, the Perons.
That's right. Unfortunately, I don't think Australia would become a third world country, but we'll definitely plummet down the developed world rankings if we keep going down this road. It's a recipe for lower living standards.
I've been watching for much of my life our figures with those of Singapore. Singapore is now heading towards, I think it's about twice as wealthy, was getting towards that as Australia, and it's heading further. Singapore has nothing except an entrepot, a port. We have all these resources and we're becoming poorer than Singapore.
And I will just say one last thing. Australia's wealth is distorted by expensive property values, which is not real wealth.
Yes, so true. I know it. It is extraordinary. But thank you very much. I think it's wonderful that you bring us the unconventional economist. You bring us your treasury of common sense, and it's all available on macrobusiness.com.au, where you do have a free newsletter and one which gives much more information if you decide to take out a subscription. Thank you very much, Leith.
Thanks, David. Speak to you next time.
Certainly.